Okay, thanks. So really very exciting part of our day. I'm really pleased to be able to introduce Dominic Endicott. UVM's relationship with Burlington and Vermont as land-grant university is important, but there's more to the story. And really one of the underlying themes of this conference has been how the land-grant mission evolves through time. And I'll talk a little bit more about that today later on. But I think part of that evolution is really learning to engage in that mission of impact that we mentioned yesterday, and how those roots spread out broadly. And I think that was some of the comments that just came up. And Dominic is a tremendous thinker on this topic, and really has done a lot of work on both what it takes and what gets in the way of universities as talent magnets and knowledge attractors. Dominic's a venture partner at Nauta Capital and a member of the board of directors of iView, InCrowd, SpotFront, Promote IQ, Connect2 Fiber, and Content Raven. And if that sounds like a lot of work, he managed in the process of the last 2 weeks to understand everything about Vermont. I was shocked at how much he's managed to consume in such a short time. So prior to Nauta, he worked at Boston Consulting Group and Monitor, and then participated in the creation of Cluster Consulting, a European startup focused on deploying mobile operations in over 40 countries. He managed U.S. operations, which grew from 0 to 50 people, and then Cluster was acquired by Diamond Technologies in 2000 to form Diamond Cluster, where he became responsible for all of North American telecommunication operations. He was then hired by Booz Allen to reinvigorate their wireless practice. Prior to all that, he received his MBA from the Sloan School at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and has a Bachelor of Science degree in economics from the London School of Economics, where they invented economics, I think, was the idea. It's really a pleasure, and we really appreciate Dominic coming up to Burlington and really helping us think through what this next stage looks like. Dominic.
Thank you very much, everybody. This is great. I'm really excited to be here. I love this city. I hadn't been here for about 5 or 6 years, and it just reminded me walking around how beautiful it is. Can people hear me okay? Okay, great. I'm going to do something a little bit interactive. I've got a bunch of slides, probably too many. I've also got a talk track. But also, I'm happy to throw the script away. If people want to interrupt me with questions, we can make it interactive, so we'll see how it goes. Also, there's a bunch of people watching this online, so hi, everybody. It's a shame you're not here. This is a wonderful place, and the weather is perfect. But thank you for joining us, as well as, obviously, everybody in the room. Thank you for being here and showing up on day number 2, after, I'm sure, lots of partying last night. I think yesterday was an amazing day. We talked about all sorts of things. I love the RISE idea, Jay. I'm going to steal that from you. I also wanted to steal the little interactive thing he did, but I was told that was off limits. But I thought that was also great, so I wish I had that. So I think let me kind of begin by outlining 2 or 3 sort of big concepts before I sort of dig into my speech. The first is I think it's really important to think big. A lot of the problems we have in our society have built up over about 70 years of really bad investment, right? Our highway system alone is probably overinvested in the range of $10 billion. We've probably underinvested in rail. Sorry, $10 trillion. $10 trillion have been overinvested in too many highways, sprawl, a lot of things that we're realizing belatedly are not good for us. We talked yesterday about how a highway cut off an entire neighborhood from the river, but it has very deleterious effects, right? And we've underinvested in transit, and those are big numbers. We've probably underinvested by about 10 trillion. And therefore, when we're thinking about solutions, we have to be thinking big. So that's sort of point number 1. Point number 2 is to think little. And what that means is often you just don't know what the right thing is to do. So you got to start with lots of sort of small experiments, see which ones work, assume that a lot of them won't work, and then double down on the winners, and then gradually escalate. And you can escalate very, very fast, but it's important to be sort of starting small. And then the third principle is to sort of think interconnected. And I think one of the beautiful things about this event is how we're bringing together lots of very different disciplines that often are not in the same room. And I think somebody said that, right? It's really at those intersections where magic happens, right? So I think those are sort of three key principles. So with that, let me see if I can start. Okay, so let me introduce myself. So, my great claim to fame is that in 2007, as my first investment as a venture capitalist, slightly by dumb luck, I invested in a company called Jitterbug. I don't know, has anybody seen the phone like this? Does it? Sometimes your parents might want it because it doesn't have too many buttons. It was actually founded by a couple in San Diego, one of whom literally invented the cell phone industry, Marty Cooper and his wife. And they realized that as we were moving to the world of smartphones, a lot of people didn't want that. They just wanted a phone that worked, that was very simple. So anyway, I was lucky to invest in this company. It took a while. We grew it from $1 million to $300 million. And then it got acquired in 2018 by Best Buy. It's now sort of Best Buy's health kind of practice. So that was an investment that worked. I won't tell you about all the investments that didn't work because, that would reduce my credibility. So I have this sort of background in venture capital, and it's been very useful for me. But I sort of realized that, venture was all about making a few people very wealthy, but what about its impact on society? And so really, since about 2017, I've been exploring the idea of, can we intersect venture and society? And I sort of coined this idea of society tech. So you sort of think about fintech and health tech and so on. What is society tech, right? And I sort of think we're at the beginnings of a society tech revolution where you can create amazing companies that can grow really fast and be very big and contribute to our economy, but that are also fundamentally attuned around social good. And I'll give you an example, one that I'm involved in today. It's a company called On Hand, and it's a volunteering platform. And what On Hand does is it allows people that want to volunteer to find people to be volunteer to, or projects to be done. It could be an environmental project. It could be helping somebody that needs their groceries packed. In fact, it got really going when COVID hit, and a lot of people were sitting at home and needed some help. And a lot of people were also sitting at home and wanted to help. And so this app matched people that needed help and those that wanted to help. A great company, right? And then you say, well, who's going to pay for this? Because this is a volunteering service. Turns out companies realize that if their employees volunteer, they end up being happier, they're more productive, they're less likely to quit, their mental health is better. So there's all these benefits to the corporations for whom these companies work. And so this company On Hand got them to pay for it. And it's now growing really fast. It's going to pass $1 million in revenue, I think, this month, up from about a third of this last year. I think it's going to be a great company. It could be a unicorn. And yet it's doing an amazing social good, right? I think this is where entrepreneurs are going, right? They all want to build these amazing companies, and this is the time for that. So I think we're entering the era of society tech. But in particular, how can we apply it at a local level? Can we do this so that it can benefit a place like Burlington or Vermont, rather than just Silicon Valley and Boston, where all of the energy has been the last few years? So let me introduce a concept which is sort of embedded in the book. And so, the book sort of really was a way to force me to think through a lot of ideas. I teamed up with a professor at Ohio State University, David Staley, and he'd written an amazing book, Alternative Universities. So if anybody is interested in what a university could look like, buy that book. I read it, and I called him, and I said, this is an amazing book. And he said, oh, you're a venture capitalist. I've been waiting for a venture capitalist to call me. So I was the one. And then we teamed up. We started looking at some ideas, and we said, how could we intersect society tech with your thinking on alternative universities? And really the result of that was knowledge towns, which is really thinking about place, universities, all sorts of things like that. And then really out of that, I try to then sort of create a framework that would simplify it and make it easier to talk about. So this is the framework. So the first level is a strong purpose of place, right? And sort of starting to ask the question, what is the purpose of Burlington, Vermont? What is its history? Where did it come from? How did it arise? Why was it here, not somewhere else? where is it today, but also where is it going? What is the function of Burlington, Vermont, right? What is the job of Burlington, Vermont? Is it supposed to be an engine for Vermont? Well, how does that look like? And so I think that there's this question of purpose, which I think is a really interesting one to try and answer. It's also one for each of us as an individual, right? What is my job? I'd been doing management consulting, and I'd been doing venture capital, and that was fine. And then I sort of had this sort of period of time where I was kind of restless and looking for something different. And I sort of realized, well, actually, maybe my job is to bring venture capital to the service of communities. And I haven't quite figured out what it is, but it's like an interesting adventure, right? So, the idea of purpose, and how do you sort of ask yourself that question at an individual level, at a group level, at a city level, at a university level? What is the purpose of UVM? So that's sort of one layer. There's a second layer, which is starting to get a little bit more practical, right? And there's sort of like 4 key things, right? Can we provide a place that is affordable? Do we have abundant housing? We have this massive issue in this country where we're probably 10 million houses short. A lot of it is down to planning and zoning rules for the last 70 years. Many of them have terrible origins. It is what it is. But we have to accept we need abundant housing. You can look at other places that have figured it out. Japan had this problem 20 years ago. They figured it out. Other places figured it out. Portland, Oregon is doing some amazing stuff. It's come out really quickly. I think Vermont is going to be a leader in New England. The law that passed only a couple weeks ago, S100, is, I think, going to be a game changer. But we need abundant housing. The second thing we need a healthy and active place. And this is a great bikeable city, but it could be a lot better. It's an active place, but it could be more active, right? There's things, even this street just outside the university, which is the main highway for people to get in and out of town, it's kind of scary. It's hard to cross, right? So there's a lot of things we could do to do better, but I think we're in a good starting place. The third one is, do we have a dynamic economy? I think we're okay. We've got a lot of good things. It's probably better than it was a few years ago. But I think the game is getting so intense that you probably need to do more there. And then do we have a knowledge ecosystem, right? Well, we have UVM, we have other universities, so I think to some extent we have that. But again, we could do a lot more. So the sort of second layer of this framework is to sort of think about what are the high-level needle movers that can change a place. And then the third level is starting to think about more specific things. Like you say, what I really need is, a thriving high street. Right? I need to make my high street better. I noticed that on Church Street, which is amazing, in fact, was copied, I guess, from the Danish model, but there's like 4 or 5 closed stores. It doesn't have a perfect vibe. It could be better. So how do we make our high street better? How can we extend that? Why don't we make more of that area walkable? So you can sort of pick one of these levers and work on it. And I guess the point is, you can start anywhere, right? You can start, at a layer, this layer. You can start at purpose. You can say, let's talk about purpose, and then we'll kind of work from that. Or you can go sort of 1 layer down, or you can do 2 layers down and pick one of these. So this is a framework that is intended to help you to kind of think through, the future of place. So with that, let me kind of lay out an example of a knowledge town. So Cambridge, England. So Cambridge, England was a nice little university town, lots of Nobel Prizes. People have, I'm sure, seen many movies and so on. But in the 1960s, 70s, it was kind of a sleepy place. Not much was going on. People studied there. As soon as they were done, they left. They came to London. They went to New York. They went everywhere else. And they started to realize that they wanted to keep some of this talent. And the first thing they did is they built a tech park in 1970. They were one of the first tech parks in England. And that was very helpful. Then they set up a venture capital firm, Cambridge Innovation Capital, and that's also been very helpful. And lo and behold, 20, 30 years later, it took a while, but now they're just this amazing place. Many people that go to Cambridge don't feel that the obvious thing to do after you graduate is to leave Cambridge, because there are so many jobs. It's probably the second largest hub of technology in the UK after London by far. And there's so many jobs there that a lot of people stay, and it's a great quality of life. Now, the one thing they haven't figured out is the abundance issue, right? So the housing is really unaffordable, which is a problem in the south of England. But everything else, I think they've done pretty well. So it's a sort of an example of what you can do. And just to give you a sense of the metrics, this is a city of about 150,000 people today. So not much different than sort of greater Burlington, if you sort of think about the entire county. They generate 30 billion a year in GDP. It's an amazing number. And the valuation of all the companies in that surrounding area is $60 billion. So these are really, really big numbers. Not to say that that's what you can achieve, certainly not overnight. It took them 50 years to get there, really. But it's kind of an example of what a knowledge town can be. It can be a place that is rural. It could be in the middle of nowhere. I really believe it can be done in any location. Another concept to introduce here is the idea of a technology multiplier. And so this graph shows the entire UK. And across the UK, over the last 10 years, you've had an amazing explosion of value. So just to sort of give you some of the numbers, in the last 10 years, roughly about a 10 billion of research that's kind of market-oriented has been done by the universities. So there's about 100 billion in total, but my estimate is roughly 10% of it is really useful. Then there's about 10 billion of seed venture capital that's gone in, but that has then attracted about 140 billion of late-stage capital. Interestingly enough, mostly coming from the US, right? A lot of American money has flowed into England because they've seen this great university research, they've seen this amazing seed venture capital, and so most of that 140 billion of late-stage money has come from New York and Silicon Valley and Boston, and there's a lesson in there. The value creation has been in the order of $750 billion of created tech companies. So roughly 10 years ago, say that sector was worth 50 billion, and today I would guess it's about 800 billion. So they've added 750 billion more. The UK government claims it's $1 trillion. I think they're a bit off. They're exaggerating. Still a really, really big number, right? And so you can sort of see this multiplier. You say, well, so 10 billion of research plus 10 billion of venture capital gets me 750 billion of value. That's pretty good. But there's more, because when you actually start to work through how that flows into the economy, my estimate is it's over $2 trillion of value to the UK, which is roughly about a third of the UK's growth in value in the last decade has come from technology. In other words, the UK has suffered a little bit, Brexit, all that kind of stuff. If they hadn't had this, it would have suffered even more. Same thing applies to the US, right? Without technology, I think the US would be in a terrible place. So the point is that this is a really powerful mechanism if you can figure out how to harness it. So this is Burlington, Vermont, and this is the campus. I love this picture, so I stole it. And you look at this and you say, wow, this is an iconic place, right? It's got the mountains, it's got the lake, it's got a beautiful college, it's a college town. We could do so much here. So it's a really good starting point. And so the question is, could we build some sort of technology corridor or knowledge corridor? So sort of, some of the things to think about is, we're kind of a long way away from everything. We are a remote place. We're 8 hours from New York and 4 hours from Boston. Some people might drive and get there a little bit faster, but it's really about 4 hours. So we're not that close. There's other places that are competing against us, maybe, that are closer. But we're in the range. There's a lot of venture money, right? Boston invested about 20 billion last year. New York, close to 30 billion. So there's a lot of money there. Both those cities have huge amounts of institutional capital. So there's plenty of capital fairly close to us. So that's an asset. If you look at the city, we've got the lake. You can see that there's quite a lot of single-family housing. So with the new regulations, a lot of that could be turned into more abundant housing. There's quite a lot to work with. So let me talk about 3 keys that we have to unlock. And I'm going to try and be very specific, because I think one of the things people are saying is it's great to have a good conversation and so on, but let's get specific, right? So what I'm going to end up doing is proposing some very specific ideas in these sort of 3 areas. So the first key is place. And even though I'm not a place expert, I'm a venture capitalist, more like, I spent a lot of time talking to people about place, reading about it, writing about it, so I'm calling myself an expert. But before we get into place, I think we need to understand a little bit more about this, what I call the suburban sprawl complex, and how harmful it is for us. So I think even though we all kind of feel it, we don't maybe know how bad it is, right? So let me just sort of share a few stats. By the way, does anybody have any questions? I'm happy to sort of stop the flow. Yes? Totally, yeah. art is an early one, right? You wanna flood the place with art, absolutely. I think you want to do everything. Art, you want to do agriculture, you want to do farmers markets, you want to slow down the streets, right? Like in Wales, they've just passed the law. Every street has to be 20 miles an hour or less. Why is that? Because if a car hits you at 20 miles an hour, you may survive it. At 30, you won't, right? As simple as that. So it's everything. But art, I would say, is right up there. I would even go further. I'd say the future of society is an experience. You want to create an experience. It's going to be like theater. And so you want to be thinking about, what is the experience of, coming into into Burlington? Where do I go? I walked the city yesterday. There's some beautiful areas, but very quickly you go into the wrong street and it's not so nice. It's not so safe. I didn't feel safe. If I were older, if I were female, I'd feel even less safe, right? So what's that experience, right? So how do we curate and create an amazing experience? And we know what it is. It's very easy to measure. We're just choosing not to do it. Any other sort of questions? Again, feel free to interrupt me at any point. Otherwise, I'll just keep rolling. So this is the problem, right? We've basically built this kind of car-based system, and we're dependent, right? It's very hard to change because you can't just say, hey, leave the car at home or go to sort of a single car. If you're living somewhere where the only way to get around realistically is by car, you can't do that. So we've built what you could call sort of the cycle of auto dependency. And, you build a highway and then you're like, oh, it's full. Let's build some more lanes. Oh, it's gotten fuller and the traffic is even worse and it's taking me even longer. Oh, let's build some more lanes, right? So we've just been doing some really dumb things. The solution is to stop doing the dumb things and start redressing them. Some places have said, you know what? Let's strip away this highway. We could build it, we can unbuild it. In some places, they've turned a highway into a river. It's been amazing, right? So everything that's done can be undone, but it's important to recognize that this is what we're fighting. This is some great work done by a guy called Donald Appleyard, and he looked at communities, and he asked the question, what happens to a community as the level of traffic, the volume, and the number of cars goes up? Well, surprise, surprise, as there's more traffic, the level of community collapses. So, why is that? Because crossing the road is no longer something that you can do without thinking. You have to sort of plan it more. I mean, you go through some cities in the US, and it's terrifying to cross the road, and people get killed. So why would they? So thinking about this, and then you say, well, hey, we don't have enough people to take care of other people. Well, maybe it's because they're afraid to cross the road, right? There's a lot of people sitting that would love to come and maybe take care of a kid or an elder person. They may be your neighbors. But if they're too scared to get from where they are to where you are, or they're too far away, they have to get in a car because we've designed it that way. Why should they, right? So maybe the solution to some of our care problems is to design cities to actually enable that. So this is important work that has been done. This is a shocking graph, right? So this looks at pedestrian and cycle fatality rate per 100 million kilometers biked. So guess what? Look at the US, right? The US is way higher than most of our European peers. And also, most of them are going down, and we're flat. In fact, this is 2019. I think if you looked at 2022, it's gone up. It's actually gotten worse with COVID, because people are like, oh, I have got a free license to go really fast. So why don't Americans walk? We walk 3,000, 4,000 steps per year on average. The Amish walk 12,000. Our ancestors used to walk 15,000. That's the number one way to be healthy, is to walk a lot. Why don't we do it? Because it's dangerous, right? As simple as that. It's also polluted. So we got to be thinking about that. If you look at our life expectancy, this is a shocking graph, right? You can see that the U.S. Had a big decline in the last 3 years, but the green graph is the US. The blue graph is basically comparable countries, say most of the European countries. See, they're now 6 or 7 years ahead of us, and even China just passed us. I mean, a lot of developing countries where they used to be 20 or 30 years behind the US, they're now at parity or passing us. And so if you look at this graph and you don't realize there's something fundamentally wrong, that the richest country in the world has this kind of life expectancy, I would challenge that, right? I think we really need to understand this. I'm not saying it's going to be easy to resolve, but if we don't look at this, why bother? This graph is really interesting. It looks at, it's scary too. It looks at distribution by income. So the red graph is the US. From the top percent to the bottom percent, that's a 14-year gap, right? So the highest level of inequality is ultimately in life expectancy, right? So rich people live 14 years longer than poor people. But the other thing that is bad here is that you compare us to the blue line is the UK. So even the very rich live less than their comparable peers in the UK. And the UK is not a healthy country. You compare this to Spain, Switzerland, and other places, it'd be even worse, right? So what are we doing wrong here? This is another one which looks at geography, right? So basically the brown areas are the ones at the bottom, so the lowest health. So you see big parts of the south have a real problem. The blue is better, so Vermont is kind of in the bluish area. Average life expectancy 79 years, so it's not bad, but it could be a lot better. So the highest would be 86. We should be thinking about why isn't Vermont at 86? It's probably got to do with rural, right? I think probably the issue is really in the rural parts of Vermont, but something to be thinking about. And yesterday we talked about sort of the health system and how we could be an exemplar. So how, this is the ultimate metric for a health system that's working well. And it's not going to be about doing more surgeries, more operations, or taking more pills. It's really going to be about walkability, bikeability. Yes? Right, because Manhattan's a highly walkable place. So they have that density. So we think, implicitly, we think that density is our enemy because we all want to have our single-family home. Sorry, we think it's our friend, but it's really our enemy, right? And so Manhattan, paradoxically, is a very safe place to live in because of that, right? So there's a lot of sort of preconceived ideas that need to be challenged. The other one is, let's say you don't care about people. You're just a hard-nosed economist. Well, you know what? It's really expensive. This sprawl costs us a lot. So the cost per household of a sprawl of kind of a not dense area, so suburban, is roughly twice what it is in the urban center. And there's a great group in Asheville, North Carolina, that's done basically profitability per acre analysis. And what they show is that typically the downtown core is way more profitable than the suburban areas. Often they're areas with minority, and sort of not the nice parts of town, but actually they're highly productive. So again, we tend to think that the productive thing to do is to build another sort of, superstore, another Walmart, and so on. Those are deserts. All the money is in the core, and the stronger you make the core, the stronger the surrounding area becomes. And this goes to the question of the knowledge corridor, right? Somebody said, hey, is it just about Burlington, Vermont? Well, my argument would be, yeah, you need to make Burlington very, very strong. And in particular, the core of Burlington. You need to make that really powerful because then that irradiates to the rest of the city, its surrounding area, and ultimately to the entire state. So you've got to rethink the economics. So that's sort of key number one, place. Before I go to key number two, which is venture, any sort of questions on place? Oh, yes, sorry. In the back, blue shirt. Speak up. Oh, I don't know if there's a mic. Use the mic.
From my career and experience, I agree with every single thing you've said. However, as you know and we all know, you've put forth some extremely challenging and maybe even controversial perspectives on place in Vermont. One of the things we're seeing here in Chittenden County is large investment and very deliberate planning and action related to what has been called edge cities, sub-regional centers. South Burlington is investing many millions in its new, quote, downtown with lots of mixed-use, high-density development. Other parts of the region are doing the same thing. How does that jibe or not with your thesis about the idea of a dense, livable core? Thank you.
Thank you. Great question. I think that you can make them work together. You got to just think very well about how you connect them, right? So a really bad way to connect them is only by car, which is probably the main way they're connected today. A really good way would be to think about transit networks and bike paths, right? So what are sort of some ways that are low impact, that promote active walking? So if you look at, for example, a place like Holland is quite distributed. It's not concentrated in a mega city, but you can easily bike to the train station. Have you seen, they have like space for like 1,000 bikes, right? So you bike there, you get on the train, you can bring the bike on the train or not, depending on where you're going, you get off. So I think you can do that, and I think that's actually a nice solution, because then you don't have this sort of mega city, you have basically a distributed network of cities. So I don't think they're in conflict, but you got to sort of think through that piece. Any other questions? Yes.
My name is Chris Camp, and I'm Executive Director of the Wyndham Regional Commission. We're the Planning Commission for Southeast Vermont. I know a lot of your presentations around Burlington, but to my mind, one of the great things that UVM could help us do is tell the story of ourselves as a state. And one of the big issues that we're having statewide is, while the changes in S101, or S100, which is going to change, has some impact on zoning, we're not making the investment in the water and wastewater infrastructure, especially in the villages throughout the state, to actually make compact settlement possible. So we say all the right stuff about policy, but we're not following it with the investment to actually sustain the village and downtown and other infrastructure that we've got, and to grow upon that statewide. And one of the things I think UVM could really help with is help us tell that story about, on a town-by-town basis, what is our capacity to actually do things like housing, to sustain our villages, to sustain the businesses in our villages, to make those places, centers for housing throughout the state. The other thing that I think UVM could really help us tell the story about is the challenge of our governance structure. We have all these teeny tiny geographies that have to make decisions upon which statewide policy is dependent. But it can take towns years to decide to even have a conversation about a subject, much less act. And so we need to really kind of objectively tell the story of ourselves so we understand how to better work with that system. The other challenge I think we have as a state, and I'm not exactly sure how we could figure this out, is in Vermont we have no aggregator of public funds between municipalities and the state. And that puts us at a comparative disadvantage nationally, because most federal programs assume the existence of some kind of aggregator of public funds to invest in intermunicipal things like transit.
Yeah, I love that. Can I sort of pick up on the third idea in particular? I may even have, let me just flash ahead. A lot of blah, blah, blah. We can get to the really interesting stuff. So let me go back to Copenhagen and pick up on your third idea, right? So Copenhagen, they also had this problem of kind of fragmentation. They were a relatively small, insignificant city, say 30, 40 years ago. They set up a development corporation, which was actually a joint venture between the state and the city of Copenhagen. So it's owned roughly by the two. In fact, they merged two companies, one which was state-owned and one which is owned by Copenhagen. They've set up this basically it's the Port Corporation. It's got a very complicated Danish name, which I won't even try to spell, but that is being critical. They've added with that around 10,000 homes. It's a very clever technique. They basically reclaim some land from the ocean, then they get it rezoned. It goes up in value. Then they borrow some money against the value of that. They use that money to both build the infrastructure, so the core infrastructure for that new neighborhood, but then they actually don't build it. They auction it off to a bunch of different developers. So that gets a little bit of diversity. It's not a single group that's doing it. And then they also put that money back into the ground. For example, they built a highway system. So not a highway, a train system. If you look at that ring, the black line there, this is the new circle line that's been built by the development corporation. They also are funding a lot of the bike paths. And so it's a very clever way in which to solve the problem, right? So to your question, how could UVM and Burlington leverage its sort of prime position? it could sort of lead in the formation of a development corporation that could have as an objective to develop different towns and cities in the region. And it could be that it starts with Burlington itself, because it has to build enough critical mass in Burlington, because it is the sort of cornerstone. But it could have a plan to work with the cities. And it could also decide to work with the towns and cities that are most willing to work with it, right? So it could say, hey, we've raised a bunch of capital. We can go to Fidelity. We can go to the philanthropy side. We can go to the investment side, because these are good returns on investment, right? If you put money, you can actually get good returns. But we're going to work with the cities and towns in Vermont that are willing to move fast and have a good plan, right? So I think there are many mechanisms that we can develop. And it's not just in Europe. So let me give you another example. So this is Columbus, Ohio. And the story there is, in 1999, the Wall Street Journal wrote a scathing report on Columbus, Ohio, and basically said, would the last person please turn off the lights? And that pissed off the great and the good in Columbus, Ohio, and they're like, well, we're going to have to do something. And part of what they did is they set up not just one, but two development corporations. So the one on the blue is called the Capital Crossroads, and the other one is called Discovery. They're effectively today, I think, the same group. I don't know why they call them different things. But again, they've sort of claimed over roughly 1,000 acres right in the downtown core, and they've helped develop about 8,000 new homes. This has been critical to then triggering a venture capital explosion. So this is getting me a little bit into the second topic, right? You can combine place-based activity with venture capital. So let me sort of go back, or let me go forward a bit. So I'm going to talk about, I've got some more stuff on place-making, but I think I'm going to sort of shift towards venture, because I think it's the other piece here. So venture capital, just to give you a sense of how powerful this is, since 1979, 75% of the growth in the stock market comes from venture-backed companies, right? So Amazon, Apple, Facebook, those kinds of companies, they've really lifted, the U.S. economy. If we hadn't had this system, we would be a lot poorer. Now, it's also true that it's very unequal, but it's also true that it has lifted up all boats, right? It's a little bit of both. And this only happened a little bit by accident, because there was a law passed in 1979 that allowed pension funds to invest in venture funds, and they're up and running, and the US was the first to do it, and that has really sort of helped create this very powerful sector. So this is a graph showing the value of the US stock market, and you see it's grown a lot, and the purple line is technology. So it's gone from roughly 12% to 22% of the US stock market. So it's really been the biggest part. And that's lifted, the graph on the right is total US wealth, right? So in the last decade, the US, it's very, worrying to look at how much debt we have. I worry about it every day, 30 trillion or whatever is the number. And I'm not sure how we're going to pay for it, right? But it's also good to know that we've added about 90 trillion in value in the last decade. So there is value here. We've also sort of taken on too much debt. But again, this has come largely from venture back, right? So let's think about how we can use this tool. And I sort of brought this earlier. Start at the University of Research, then seed and venture, then multi-stage. That creates digital jobs. That creates wealth. So that's sort of the model. Going back to Columbus, Ohio, so I talked about what they did on the placemaking side. They also started to do some stuff to create a venture capital sector. And one of the things they did is, in fact, the Ohio State University, I'm always told it's the Ohio State University, another land-grant school, actually started working with my alma mater, MIT, in a sort of a spin-out strategy. How can we do more spin-outs? They did this about 6 or 7 years ago. Also, as the city was improving on the quality of life, some of the VCs in the West Coast said, hey, I think there's an opportunity. So there's a group called Drive VC, a bunch of ex-Silicon Valley guys. They said, let's move to Columbus, Ohio. I think they'd grown up there because we see an opportunity, right? So that sort of starts to get the entrepreneurial spirits. I think Burlington's quite close to that. And then you can see over the last 10 years that venture went from roughly about 100 million a year going into startups to 1.5 billion a year, right? A real explosion. And that means now you have some very large companies, and now all sorts of other VCs are like, hey, I've discovered Columbus, Ohio, right? Well, it took a while, but it's happening. Same thing in Austin, Texas. In fact, let me go to this. part of the problem is that venture is moving, it's spreading from the usual places. So it used to be all in Silicon Valley. It used to be, if I couldn't drive from my VC office in Sand Hill Road to your company, I wasn't going to invest. And that was the old model until about 10 years ago. But now, this is a map of all the cities in the US where there's at least one unicorn. So $1 billion company more. So 10 years ago, there were like 7 cities in the US. Now there's about 42. I think you're going to see in another 5 or 10 years, there's going to be about 100 and even more, right? So venture is rapidly decentralizing. What does this look like? It looks like the Industrial Revolution, right? So we go back 200 years ago, you had the same phenomenon. It's now happening. But this time, what's driving it is AI, right? So this is a map of hiring, and the bubble size is basically where the concentration is, right? So you can see that there's a lot in the usual places, the West Coast, Boston, and so on. And then there's a little bubble up there. That's us, right? Burlington, Vermont. So we're in the game, which is good. What's bad is we're competing against all the other bubbles, right? So we have to play our A game, right? That's why we have to do everything great. We have to be an amazing talent magnet. We need to be able to attract the best people. We need to sort of think about how we do that. What's really interesting, yes, please. Question. Yes. Great question. So, and a complicated question to answer because there's probably like 10 different departments at the federal level that are looking at this. So the National Science Foundation, the EDA, the EPA. So they're all kind of looking at it. Probably the EDA is the natural place that they're looking at. In fact, they have a program right now to create 20 new tech centers. And explicitly, they don't want to go to the usual suspects. They want to go to new places. And in fact, the good news is New England, northern New England, so the states of Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine are in a privileged position. So in fact, if I go to this slide. This is a chart from the EDA, and they break it up into regions and so on. But what's interesting is, so they want to designate by August of 2023, so this year in 3 months, 20 locations that will get a little bit of support to develop a strategy to then bid for up to 50 to 70 million each location. They'll probably award that to about 7 locations. So the first wave, you get in, but then you have to put a real plan, and then the winners get 50 to 70 million to effectively incubate a venture capital economy. Now, what's really interesting is that 1/3 have to go to what they call EPSCoR states. It turns out that Vermont is an EPSCoR state. There's only about 15 in the country. And in fact, there's a group called EIG.org, which did a ranking of 350 MSAs in the US. And among the EPSCoR states, guess what is number 1? It's Burlington and South Burlington. So for some reason, we probably could have a shot at getting past this designation. Getting the 50 to 70 is going to be a harder lift. So I think that's an indication of where the federal government is trying to go, right? They're saying, let's not give more money to Boston or even Columbus or Austin, Texas, because they're up and running. They don't need us anymore. You know who needs us? Is the next wave of places, right? So I think the timing is actually really good. But again, you have to play your A game. Question? 5 minutes? Totally. I mean, it's all kinds of knowledge, all kinds of skills. None are better than other. They all have a different role in the ecosystem, right? So, and I think among the knowledge institutions, the universities, the community college, part of it is thinking about what can each of us bring to this party? How do we train people? A lot of, say, more combining intellectual and sort of physical. There's artistic. There's community building, right? There's all these different kinds of knowledge, and they all contribute to the whole. Or if we lack it, let's start something new, right? One of the ideas that David my partner in crime coined is the micro college, the micro university. And I like the analogy in the book. We sort of talk about this idea of the microbreweries, right? 20 years ago, there were only 60 breweries left in the country. And then the microbrewery explosion came about. There's now 8,000. What about if the same thing happened with colleges? What if, right now there are 4,000 colleges, roughly 40 of them are going out of business every year, some of them in Vermont, some of them today still at risk. What if we had an explosion of new kinds of colleges, but maybe they don't have to be the traditional one. They could be a micro college. They could be with 2 teachers and 20 students, and they could be incubated by UVM, for example, right? And so I think sort of thinking very broadly is critical. Since I've run way past my allotted time, I'm just going to shoot to the end. And again, these slides are available, and I'm sort of happy to go deeper. So I won't. I'll go kind of to this slide, which is about UVM. And so the question is, okay, this is all great. What is the job and what's the role of the university? And I would argue that in each of these 3 areas, I haven't really talked about talent attraction, but you can think about what is a university? A university is a machine to attract talent. It's really good at that, right? They hire some really smart professors from all over the world. We saw some professors that weren't born here. They sort of came from other parts of the world. They come here. They're really good at attracting students. They do that really well. Well, maybe could we take that engine for talent attraction and rewire it to attract people to come and live in Burlington? We have, probably over 100,000 alumni. I think if you went to somebody in Boston or New York and you said, listen, let's say you can earn, a quarter, 25% less than you're earning right now, but your quality of life, your cost of living would go up. Would you move your family? You would be flooded with people, right? So how do we generate this talent attraction? So university is really good at that. In terms of placemaking, university owns 1,000 acres between Burlington and South Burlington. It owns, I think, 4,000 acres overall. It could buy more. It could do a joint venture with a city, with a state to create a development company. So it's a major player in placemaking. If you think this road around us is too fast, well, maybe it can take a role in slowing that down. It would have an incredible effect. Yesterday, I actually walked from my hotel downtown to here. It was a bit sweaty. But I noticed derelict buildings. I took pictures of a lot of derelict buildings. So if we set up a development corporation, we could sort of improve those places. That has a big impact on quality of life, on perception. And then in the middle, venture, right? I think it's amazing that we're doing so much research. I think the number 250 or so million a year is a great number. Just to give you a kind of a comparison, Oxford University does about 800 million a year, and they have a 800 million pound fund. So I think the right number for UVM, if it's doing 250, is roughly a 200 to 300 million fund for spin-outs alone, right? And that could be sort of the place. So I guess my sort of recommendation, which I think is over here, is going back to those sort of 4 anchors, right? Make sure you can provide abundant and affordable quality of life, right? If you do nothing else, that's the most important, but that's going to take a while. In parallel, make it more Dutch style. A critical number is in Holland, 60% of the kids, more than 60% of the kids bike to school or walk to school every day. In the US, the number is 10%. I guarantee you, if you fix that, I don't think it's probably not 10% here, maybe it's 20%, but it's not 60%, I'm pretty sure. If you have 60% of the kids biking to school, you've figured it out, right? So get that right. So that's sort of that lever over there. Launch a fund that's at least 100 million. In the UK, there are now 10 clusters of universities doing that. I'm actually working for one of them. It's a bit new, it's a bit uncomfortable, we're not quite sure what we're doing, but it's the future. There's probably going to be a fund of funds set up by the UK government to do this, right? The US government has woken up and realized they need to do the same thing. So this first wave is $500 million that's going to be put into these 7 or 8 new clusters, but they could actually do up to 10 billion, right? So they could be developing 40, 50, 60 new clusters, right? So the money's there, the will's there, the timing is right. So that would be my sort of final idea is like, do it. So with that, thank you very much.